Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first panel. It is called Designing Solutions, and we have some amazing speakers to speak on that today. We can start by maybe each of you introducing yourselves and tell us about what you do, what you're working on, a little bit about that. Yes, you can start.
Who goes first? I'll go first. Hi, can you hear me? Is it good? Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm the co-founder and the CEO of Saffron Brand Consultants, which is a brand consultancy with offices in London, Madrid, Vienna, and Tokyo. And we build brands. We help clients build brands that work. At the end of the day, and we'll talk about this later on, but at the end of the day, if you want to be successful, you want the work that you do for your clients to work for them. And to work for them, in our view, they've got to be memorable, and the way you build memorable brands is through the experience. So I've just mentioned three things that are the pillars of what we do, which is brands that work, brands that are memorable, and they become memorable through the experience we create for them.
Great. Hey, everybody. Can you hear me? Awesome. I'm Andy Barron. I'm the executive creative director and co-founder of Turner Duckworth New York, where we opened up in 2016 after 25-ish, almost 30 years in San Francisco and London. I spent about 5 years in our San Francisco office back in the day. I miss California. So if you're not familiar with us, like I said, we've been around for a while. And what's interesting is we got our start in packaging design. So for the first third of our existence, all we did all day long was design packaging. And what was interesting about that is when you think about packaging, it's got to work so hard in an instant. You have to be able to be noticeable on shelf. You have to be able to communicate what you're selling. You have to be interesting. To Jacob's point, you have to be memorable, unmistakable in a lot of ways. And what we did, I would say in probably the mid-2000s, was transition from being focused only on packaging to really think about the broader world of visual identity. And what's great is we were able to take the things that we learned about packaging, where you have to be able to catch someone's attention in an instant for them to remember it once if they didn't purchase it or if they see it again later, and think about that at a much bigger scale. So now we work on everything from, right now we're creating a brand in the, let's say, confectionery space. We're working on work for a big global bank. We're working on things in digital healthcare. So we work in a variety of sectors, projects big and small, brands you've heard of, brands you will one day, ideally. So we have to be as flexible as possible. So I would just say we do a pretty broad range of things, and that's just in the New York office. So that's me.
Hi, is this on? Hi, I'm Eddie Opara. I'm a partner and one of the principals at Pentagram. I'm going to keep this quite short. What am I working on at this moment in time? Many different things. I think it's because at Pentagram we see ourselves as generalists. We like to look right over a large landscape of visual communications and product design and beyond. And working in the healthcare area at this moment in time, in education, in 2 different universities, dealing with arts and cultures at different museums that we're sort of building out for my particular team, and also fintech as well. And beyond, the way that Pentagram is set up, it's really these sort of micro pentagrams in Pentagram. So they are all sort of individual studios or ateliers that make up the largest independent design firm in the world, in 4 different locations: London, New York, Austin, Texas, and Berlin. And nobody can tell me what to do. Isn't that fun? Yeah, I'll leave.
Thank you so much. I also know that Jacob and Eddie, you guys have some short videos to show. I would love to show that to the attendees before we move forward.
That's just New York.
And I'm the underachiever that didn't bring a sizzle reel. But I do see that Sprite can on the table over there that we recently designed. So no sizzle reel, but in the real world, there's a piece of our work.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, this kind of leads us into our first question, but you guys work with a lot of clients, a lot of different brands. I'm sure that these are very diverse clients. They probably have various problems that they would like you guys to solve. And I'm sure in addition to that, your teams are full of people with different perspectives. I'm curious, when you get a project, like how does you and your team approach it?
I'll start. With skepticism. It's always good to be a skeptic when dealing with a client. Why? Because they haven't told you everything within a particular RFP proposal or the brief. There's more to discover, and it's really good to be skeptical and ask exceedingly tons and tons of questions. If you think that those questions are going to irritate them and they find out they are irritated, then you know that you've ruffled some feathers and then you need to go a little further. And to a certain degree, once you believe that you've got enough out of that particular inquiry, you go to the next step of trying to redefine the brief itself, if and where you can. And that's the starting point of the overarching process from us.
Well, I mean, obviously it's an incredible point, and it's true that always clients try to keep the cards very close to their chest. But if I had to add something to skepticism, I would say humility, and I always tell the teams that start every engagement with the humility of knowing that we know a hell of a lot about brands and branding, but we know very little about the industry. We know very little. I mean, I might have worked for 15, 18 telcos in my life, and yet when I meet with the CEO of a telco, I know nothing about telecommunications compared with them. And you have to take things with a bit of humility because at the end of the day, you have to come up with something that works for them, not that works for you. And that's where the magic of collaboration starts working. And when you work with the client, this is where the whole thing starts creating a certain magic, which is actually when you end up coming up with super powerful ideas.
And to build on that, I think the way that I would put how we approach the early stages of any engagement is selective amnesia, because you kind of have to forget everything that you know about a sector, everything that you know about what you've done before, what's worked for other clients. I think it's really easy to say, oh, well, I've worked on a bank before, so I know how working on a bank should be. And exactly to that point, you have to think of every assignment, every engagement, every client, every project differently because the objectives are going to be different. The brand is going to be different. The audience is going to be different. And so that's on the sort of relationship end result side. But also, you don't want to repeat yourself creatively. So you want to be able to think about things with a pretty clean slate each time. I think you'll notice if you are aware of our work at all, we really don't, we try our best to not repeat ourselves as much as possible. And that's a really big goal of mine in the New York studio is to have a focus on original thinking. So even if you're designing the 15th telecom in a row, you want to make sure you do it a different way every time. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love the points you guys made about like having a new headspace every time you approach something new and like the collaboration involved in that. Sort of to go along with the theme of the conference, which is synergy. I'm curious of your thoughts on what the power is in having that sort of interdisciplinary approach. I mean, I know, Eddie, I know that you've designed like packaging and branding, but also that you've done stuff like installations and exhibitions, and you're like a huge fan of interdisciplinary approaches. I'm curious to know more about like what is a strength in approaching a problem in that way.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in a sense you don't know it all, and aspects of what Jacob's basically stated is humility is part of that, and maybe to a certain degree that's sort of a conscious or unconscious aspect of what you're dealing with. You are a knowledge vacuum. I'm always surprised when I go to a party that has nothing to do with designers, and you're potentially the dumbest person in the room, and then suddenly you become the most interesting because they're wondering, how do you know about this stuff? It suddenly just comes out of your mouth that you have had these collaborations with all these different people and personalities, and all these challenges that you've had to go through. That it makes you who you are, right? And you want to sort of be able to communicate to others, to other audiences, with that information from my point of view, in a visual manner. And more and more it becomes very successful, and people come up to you and say, how did you, like, oh, you were the guy that did that, or you were the team that did that, how did you do that? And it's like, well, because I learned from these people these things. You should read this information, you should talk to this particular person, it wasn't just me. And that makes everything a lot more fun and engaging. And also it takes the spotlight off you as well.
What I would say also is, kind of to build on that, is to building a rich experience of all the people on your team. So we don't just exist. It's not, what's that show on Apple TV where they get their mind erased when they get into the office? It's not like that, where we only exist in our design studios. We all have lives outside of work. We all do things that are not design. So by collaborating with people who have these rich life experiences, who know lots of things, or maybe a little bit about a lot of things, are able to bring the kind of knowledge and bring the kind of background across a variety of disciplines that might influence the work that you do together. So things that you might learn about playing music might apply to something that is happening in a project with a client on a completely different plane, or a completely different discipline. So I think the ability of coming together with people that have lots of different perspectives and lots of different knowledge bases is ultimately the best way to get interesting work.
When you work at Saffron, you work for companies, you work for brands that come from everywhere. We have clients in Japan, clients in California, clients in Canada, or in the southern or South Africa, and brands become brands when you experience them, and brand is a promise of an experience delivered. An experience has a lot to do with the way behavior is set between the user and the brand itself. But when you try, but design plays, the aesthetics elements, the visual elements of the brands play also a very, very important role. And I remember talking to a bunch of our people back in December about, again, I want to go back to this idea of not being arrogant. And we cannot pretend to design something in London that works in Southeast Asia, because we don't understand the elements that really tick in Southeast Asia. We cannot design something in Madrid that works in the Middle East, because, as I'd said then, was that experience might be universal, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we all know, the ergonomics work everywhere. But beauty is relative. And what is beautiful here in the West might not be beautiful in the East. And what might be beautiful in the North might not be beautiful in the South. So that's why, again, if you want to be successful in creating something that actually resonates with your audiences, and the audiences are not global, but even when the audiences are global, you have to have a balance of being able to tell the client you have to have the courage of our convictions, as Wally used to say, but also be humble enough to say, listen, I know you want a palm tree, and I hate palm tree, because I don't think what you want to build can be built with a palm tree. So let's try to find something which looks like a palm tree, but is actually beautiful to your different audiences. So that combination is actually something that you really have to navigate all the time. And I find it quite interesting.
That's really cool. So a lot of balance, learning, adapting is sort of the themes I'm getting. Along the lines of that, when we talk about working for all these different brands, how do you make, especially for brands that are already very well known and recognizable, how do you make these different brandings or designs, I guess, have impact and resonate with both the clients and to the intended audience? How do you balance both of those?
I think when it comes to brands that are pre-existing, so sometimes you're doing brand creation and you get to invent everything from scratch. A lot of what we do, I would say the majority of what we do are redesigns, are creating new things for old brands. And I think a lot of it comes down to two things. One is making sure that the brand has a fundamental core creative idea at the center that resonates both with the client and resonates with the audience, and finding ways to unlock that through design. So I think for a couple examples, right? So we recently, a couple years ago, redesigned McDonald's, and everything in the world of McDonald's is around this idea of feel-good moments. So everything that we design should reinforce this concept of feeling good, of bringing people together, of creating memories over food, right? So by using design to unlock that idea and make sure that everything that you're doing can ladder back to that, it makes our job really easy. It makes it easy for us to be able to have a conversation with the client around what is right and what's wrong. It makes it easy for us to communicate with the audience and connect with them on that level, because what they've found over the years is that core idea resonates, right? So that's just one example, that's just McDonald's, but I think that the best work we do always connects to a central idea, and using design to reinforce and unlock and find new ways to come at that idea is typically the best way to do it. Another thing to think about, just an older example from what we've done, is Coke, and Coke is all about joy, right? So it's very easy for brands in, let's say, the soda industry, or in the we do a lot of work in beer, for you to think about the sort of base functional need state requirements of something like that: refreshment, coldness, it's liquid, I'm thirsty, I'm gonna drink a Coke. But that's not what brands are built on. Brands are built on emotion. And something like Coke is all about joy. So one of our famous stories, that we put the design that we had done in a focus group, and one of the questions that they asked was, does this red can make you feel refreshed? And of course the answer is no, because everyone wants blue for refreshment. And obviously we're not going to change Coke from red to blue, but the idea is making sure that instead of following the sort of expected codes of a category of a brand, always laddering back to that core emotional idea is what, in my opinion, yields the best work.
You know, we create foundational systems or designs. So, in a sense, a lot of the work is, transforming a known entity, or a new entity into something which is completely different. And so it's slightly different from what Andy's stating from our point of view. But what is true is, from that foundational construct, we are the providers of that system for other design studios or consultancies to build up on, right? And interconnect into a variety of different subsystems. And to do that, we need to create very open and clear, very cogent branches towards those particular areas, so that there is this sense of logical consistency via rational thinking that we're producing something that is transformational and progressive for those other design consultancies to draw from, and also internally as well. So we have to be exceedingly careful about how we build that out over the course of time. And it's lovely to see a lot of design systems that we have created and identities that we've created still in the works because they were built to last. The sense of longevity was there, but there's a sense of being malleable to adjust them for the conditions of the future. And I think that that's also a better thing. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater each and every time. You create these types of systems, and that's an important factor to remember.
A lot of the time I'm asked what makes a client call you? Why a client calls you for a rebrand? Or what is your areas of expertise? What industry you really excel on? And constantly my answer is there's no particular area of expertise except change. Brands, organizations call you for a rebrand when change happens. And this is why, depending on, if you look back historically, in the 90s, there was a lot of work in telcos because there was an enormous transformation in the telecoms sector. Obviously, when the dot-com happened, there was a hell of a lot of stuff going on around the dot-com. Now there's an enormous amount of work in the energy sector because energy is being liberalized and energy is being transformed into non-fossil fuels, etc. Change is a fascinating word, but at the same time, it's a pretty tricky word. Because when change happens, you don't know you don't really know, because you don't have a crystal ball, where change is going to take the organization to. But on the other hand, change gives you an enormous amount of opportunities to really explore different avenues that you can really create. But unless you have a creative ethos, a big idea that really helps you, navigate, it's the North Star, you might fall into the trap of the different opportunities that change can open to you. I cannot emphasize how important it is to collaborate with a client, and the more you work with larger organizations, as you said, the more you realize that these large organizations have very well-established, very well-manned in-house design teams. I was talking with Mike Abink, a former Safranite that was responsible for the IBM Plex and all the development of the IBM brand on Monday. And he told me that they got 400 people in IBM Bloom, the design. And the quality of the people that they have in-house is phenomenal. So the same thing is happening to us when we work with Meta. We've been working with Meta for the last, Facebook and now Meta, for the last 2.5 years, and the quality of the in-house design team that there is exceptional. You could poach any of them any minute. So I've been doing this for about 34 years, and 34 years ago, in-house design teams were not there. And it was much easier for us to really come up and say, you have to do this, you have to do that. And they would say, oh, yes. Now, chances are that, first, they know more about their industry than you do, and two, they might know more about design than you do. So you have to be, so the best approach there is to really establish a sense of collaborations, because they are open to collaborate because they appreciate that they only work in a single thing every day of the week, and we are bringing much fresher, much diverse and versatile views of what's happening in the world. So I think this attitude of collaboration is the one that actually really will take you to places where the client feels happy and the ultimate customer will feel happy.
One more thing I wanted to say about change just generally, I think is one of the most important things to emphasize, is that what we always encourage our clients to think about is you don't want to change for no reason. You don't want to change for change's sake. You don't want to change because you're chasing TikTok trends. You don't want to change because you just think it's time to. So a really important example of that, or a big example of that, is we were fortunate enough to do some work with BlackRock over a few years. We worked on BlackRock, iShares, Aladdin. And the reason that we did the assignment and the reason that we helped them change is because for almost 30 years, the only thing that they were known for was being the world's largest asset manager. And that's not enough to build a brand. Scale is not enough to build a brand. No one thinks of Apple and thinks, oh, they're a big company, so I'm going to buy an iPhone. No, I think it's really important to be able to visually communicate through branding and through design what a brand stands for.
Totally.
And they were at a critical turning point where they had landed on this idea that was relevant, that was true, around empathy and around the idea that financial well-being is as important as your physical well-being and mental well-being. So we created a system that brought more empathy into the brand. We brought more distinctiveness because a lot of brands in their sort of considerations that all kind of look the same. They look like banks, essentially. They were blue. They used really corporate typography, things like this. So we brought a lot of warmth into the system, and that was really intentional, to help make them stand out, B, to reinforce this idea of empathy, and 3, to help change perception and the mindset around this organization, and to have them reflect something that was more than just scale.
I love that. I feel like emotion, empathy was mentioned a few times, as well as change, not only in the way like design outcomes come about, but also the way people work. I mean, like some fields related to design didn't even exist like 10 years ago, and I feel like that's super cool to see. I would love to hear a bit more about your thoughts on empathy and accessibility of a brand. Are there ever like unintended consequences of designs that are not considered until they reach the public? Yeah, I would love to hear some insight on that.
Well, I think that there needs to be sort of a clarification on the aspects of empathy. Empathy is always needed in pretty much everything that we do, especially in today's society, right? And so, in a sense, it's not a given, but it needs to always be part of the ingredients that you're dealing with on a date. When it comes to accessibility, that's another aspect that is a need. We don't know enough about accessibility, and when we talk about accessibility, we're doing a project, more so within the environmental space, and a very important project. And what basically occurred was that we've done a lot of work on accessibility aspects. We understand ADA, compliancy rules, regulatory rules from federal level, and we got our report back, our feedback from the client who had a accessibilities or an inclusion expert, that when I read it, it basically was all about WACG regulations, and which is online regulations rather than ADA-based regulations for physical space. And I was so amazed. Like, you're telling me I've got all my stuff wrong with all our experience that we've done, and you're dealing with it from a WACG rules. So in a sense, there's a lot of stuff going on at this moment in time with a lot of so-called experts that do not know the sense of space of this area. And it's because we look at design, and a lot of people do now look at design from a digital standpoint, and they're forgetting the physical world. And we have to be very, very on point to collaborate, to integrate those two things together to make them work better. For instance, there are no regulatory rules in regards to a physical interface on a wall for somebody who is handicapped, right? It doesn't exist, right? But within the digital world, there is. And so there needs to be this melding to occur needs to work. Now, there's also another thing that Jacob's really brought up, and that's localization of accessibility, right? The ideas of something that's good in design in Asia is not the same in somewhere in Europe, and it's actually the same thing with accessibility elements as well, more from a physical space element, but there's reasons for that. There's a cultural aspect towards that as well, and there's a lot of disabilities and other cultural challenges that we do not know about. And so when we start to build up and out these rules and regulatory elements, we have to remember what we're forgetting, right? Another aspect of this is we also need to know when to shut them off. So there needs to be a democratic structure of, especially on the digital end, that if you're loading up a site that is fully accessible, that's really fantastic. That's the right thing to do. But then you may be stripping out a lot of character and even part of the aspect of what a brand does, right? So you have to be able to turn it off for another person. Or have different optional levels of accessibility. If that doesn't exist, then why are we doing this?
And that has brought a sea of sameness in the digital world, which is
That's correct.
Absolutely disgusting. All this dictatorship of 3 clicks to check out or 2 clicks to check out has brought a world of flatness everywhere you experience the digital world. And I keep saying, forget about assuming that UX is a digital code, 2 words for digital world. The guys that invented the wheel knew a bit about user experience. Or we're not going to tell Charles and Ray Eames how to design a chair and the ergonomics behind user experience. And the same thing goes on and on and on in all the physical world. Of course, you have to understand usability. You have to understand how we're doing we've been working for the V500, which is a super interesting organization that assembles, they call the valuable 500 companies, Fortune 500 companies that really invest for the integration of people that have disabilities into the business world, into work. And this has taught us a hell of a lot of stuff that we, fortunate as we are because we have no disabilities, except for having to wear glasses to read, didn't know. And the same effort that you have to make to adapt yourself culturally to Asia or to Africa or to the Middle East, you have to make to really understand that people with disabilities need to be tackled, to be integrated in society at large. And when rules and regulations for the physical world lag behind the ones in digital, I think it's our duty as designers not to wait for the law to establish them, but for us to take the lead and convince organizations that they have to really take the lead in making this good for people with disabilities. But this idea of understanding experience or limiting experience only to the digital world is such an enormous mistake. And when we forget that the physical world is where we actually live and we actually interact with people, it's fundamental that we understand that experience has to work seamlessly between the digital and the physical world.
And I think there's an underlying theme here. And I think it's sometimes as designers, really easy to forget that the thing that you're making is for other people. Like that's the most basic thing in the entire world. But it's really easy to think about design, and especially for younger designers, to think about the work you're making in the context of how other designers are going to react to it, how it's going to appear on social media? Is it going to win me design awards? Is it going to make me famous? Is this going to be a piece of work that it's going to end up in, design textbooks for future students, et cetera? Where ultimately the things that we create are for everyone. And they're for the end users of the brands that we work with. They're not even necessarily for the employees. Like, of course they are for the employees at the brands we work for, but ultimately they're for their consumers and for their audiences. So you have to be empathetic to kind of understand how the things that you design are going to be used, how they're going to be seen, how they're going to be consumed, and just kind of take yourself out of it, take your peers out of it, take all of those things that can easily cloud how you think about and how you make decisions when you're designing. Remove that from the equation, because the most important part is how these things are going to end up being used in the world.
And to another point, and maybe this is a little bit over the top, but it's about the idea of, am I actually is design about solving problems? And when I was a student, I always had a problem with that term. So what do? We solve problems. I'm like, really? I really solved this problem for everybody? I really don't think I have, right? I think I've progressed upon it, but I don't think I've solved it. And I think we have to get into that particular standpoint. It goes back to what you're saying about humility. And you look at it from this particular angle. My sister's a scientist, and runs a part of a school in the University of Westminster in London. And she, years ago when we were kids, basically said, scientists will never say that they've solved something 100%. They will never, ever say it. There's always the condition that that will potentially change what they've actually either been dealing with. Look at it from the point of view of the pandemic, and look at it from the point of view of the virus, of a virus, of COVID, right? And look at it from the point of view of these new drugs that we are, that we can actually now take. It doesn't work for everybody. We haven't solved the problem. The conditions are going to change. You're going to have to keep fighting and fighting and fighting, all right? Because those conditions are transforming, and thus you have to stay alert. And that's the same thing in regards to what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. That's a lot to think about. It seems like, designers have to balance so many different considerations. I guess sort of moving to something that attendees might be curious about. I would assume everyone here wants to be a good designer, whatever that may mean. But I also feel like for a lot of people that like design, part of what gets them so much enjoyment is sort of the expression aspect and the creativity. I guess especially for you guys now that you are working in design, how do you sort of balance the expression, your artistic expression side versus I have a client, I have something that like a task I have to complete? Are those opposing forces? Do they work together? And like, what happens if you get negative feedback? Does that affect your artistic expression and just grappling with those?
To me, there's a big difference. Probably I'm the only one that has not been trained as a designer in this room. I'm an engineer, so nobody's perfect. And as if I wasn't convinced that I didn't like engineering, I did a master's degree in engineering just to torture myself even more. I must say, however, that it's my brain has been aligned in a particular way that actually worked and helped me a lot in life. There's a big difference between design and brand. Design the beauty of design doesn't have the request, doesn't have the mandatory request to have a business purposeful request to work. Brands need to work for the client. Brands need ultimately to clearly transmit and communicate what the organization stands for. Obviously, there's an element of beauty that needs to be there, because beauty is universal in the sense that we all love beauty. But I always use the case of Ryanair. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the brand, Ryanair, which is a low-cost airline in Europe, which I always mention as one of the most successful brands in the airline industry. It's probably one of the worst pieces of design that you will ever experience in your life. And it's probably one of the worst experiences you will experience in your life. But the reality is that Ryanair promises you shit, and you get shit. You get shit from the moment you book your flight, to the moment you lose your mug, to the moment there's a ruffle on the flight, to the yellow that is really shines into your eyes from the moment you walk to the shouting of the crew. Everything is shit. But that's what they promise you. They promise you shit, and they give you shit. And it's a wonderful brand because it works. And it's Europe's largest airline in terms of aircraft and in terms of flights, daily flights. I love design. I love art. I love architecture. And there's an enormous difference between sitting in front of a beautiful building or incredibly well designed airline experience and sitting on a Ryanair plane. But it is us as practitioners of brand need to be very careful that at times your client is someone that wants a brand that works and is ready to jeopardize and to compromise beauty for work. And it's awful, and it's super depressing for the design team. And it's super depressing for us because everything we want to do is to come up with beautiful stuff that works. And the big challenge that we have, like us, Pentagram, Turner Duckworth, and Saffron, and many other super powerful brand consultancies and design consultancies do, is to really try to marry beauty with work. Because it can happen. You can have brands that work that are beautiful. But at times, a client, if you work on branding, another thing is that you work on something else, like Stuart before, he could design funny shoes, and at the end of the day, if you have enough women, because at the end of the day, for women, enough women that buy those shoes, he's fine. In our particular case, we work for enterprises, for commercial enterprises, and it's got to work for them. And if it doesn't work for them, you got a problem there. I know it's a bit depressing what I'm telling you, and maybe my colleagues disagree, but don't forget the Ryanair case, because it's a wonderful brand, because it promises shit and it gives you shit.
To continue on the term of shit, I had a client years ago that we were working for, and he came in one day. We'd finished doing the work, and he came on one day with his co-founder, and he said, "Eddie, you have turned shit into gold." And I was actually sort of taken aback by that, but he was kind of right. He basically stated that I didn't cover. It's not. Design is not about the idea of covering shit. it's really integrating it and trying to transform it into something that is worth the effort, right? And that's exceedingly important to remember. But there are certain things that can help you down the road, right? Especially when you're dealing with brand, is when you're starting. I've seen on many occasions the positioning of a brand and then the visual brand, and I'm thinking, these two things do not go together. How the hell is this supposed to work? Right? And you've seen this before. And it's really the idea of that you had potentially two parties in that project that didn't really either talk to each other, didn't collaborate with each other, didn't comprehend each other at all, and just went and did whatever they needed to do. And it's this idea that I call the bridge. You have to create this bridge between these two efforts, and they need to work. Either you strip out or you add specific elements or terms or tenets or reconstructing the aspects of what that pillar actually means on a visual scale to make something work within the design factors, visual design factors. And we relay this and we work with the clients to do that because they are not often able to see these differences. Sometimes they are fed a lot of stuff in regards to the initial strategy, and they're like, this is fantastic. And then they're fed a lot of stuff from the visual side of it, and this is fantastic, and they just put them together, and then they go off, and then it doesn't work. And they want to find out why it doesn't work, and then they break everything down again, and throw it all away and start again, and that's not what you should do. I don't know if it's sort of answering your question, but in a sense, the idea of being expressive is exceptionally important, but it needs to couple itself with key values that you're dealing with. And if it doesn't couple with that, then you should really start to consider how it can. Because this company and this audience need to use it on a day-to-day basis, right? And that's exceedingly important, right? That you put a lot of effort into it, you've been expressive, you've been curious, but if there's no rational thinking behind this and it doesn't connect in regards to the specific model, then you should let it go.
One of the biggest challenges that I've personally had in my career, and we have as an agency all the time, and I think probably all three of us have had over the course of time, is that our job is more often than not convincing people that we're not decorators. I think we often get, right? Our clients, even peer agencies that we work with, sometimes think that we just come at the last second and sprinkle magical design fairy dust on things. And it's really infuriating because ultimately design isn't just visual art. It isn't just making things pretty for pretty's sake. I think the idea is that design is communication at the most basic level. And the thing that we're communicating, in my opinion, the most important thing to communicate often is how you feel about a brand, its feeling. So I actually think design is a lot more related to music than it is fine art. Because if you think about music, ultimately, the reason why we like the music that we do is it makes us feel a certain way. When we're in one mood, we might listen to classical music. When we're in a different mood, we're gonna listen to hardcore. When we're in a different mood, it just depends, right? And that's exactly why Ryanair is successful, is because they make you feel angry. Like, at least you feel something. And to me, the least successful work is the most boring work. So it could be the prettiest thing in the world. It could have just the right color palette. It could have this incredibly beautiful typography. But if it doesn't make you feel anything, ultimately it is a failure. And I think a lot of what we see in design today is designed superficially, unfortunately. And I think that if you think about elevating substance over style and thinking about communication over decoration, then you're on the right path.
I love that point about decoration. It actually is one of the motivations for this year's theme. I mean, even I feel like I've grown up hearing that, like, oh, you can just design the poster or like do some decoration. And it even took me some time to realize, like, oh, like I'm more important than just adding something at the end. And I really hope that all the attendees like leave this conference feeling like the same, because I do think designers spend a lot of time just like convincing other people that what you're doing has an impact and that they should pay attention to you. And so I love all the points that were made. I know that we're coming close to time, but I do want to take a few questions. So we'll have one of the staff come up and you guys can submit questions to the Slido, and we can take a few of those before we get into lunch. I can take the questions. Okay, let's see.
I have one question I can ask.
Yeah, you can go.
Thanks so much for talking. And I just had a question about when you work with companies, and especially startups or smaller companies, how do people who, this is their company, this is their baby, how do they feel putting their design, their image, their reputation in the hands of like a design company or people who want to kind of have an impact without maybe changing how they initially envisioned their company?
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of interesting point. I have some years back dealt with. I'm not going to name the client, who I actually love a lot, but they came in and there was sort of questions about like why are we doing this, and like, well, why are you here? And they really they were, I think they were really told by the VC to go check into the clinic and be assessed, and so what we saw was two young guys from Columbia who kind of dropped out and started this company with millions of users, and they just said, well, we kind of picked something from some clip art, and we picked this from this, and we kind of put it together, and this is what we've got, and we kind of like what we've got, and so what can you guys do for us? And it was really more about listening, right? It is a little bit, as I say, going into a clinic, it's like therapy. The way that you get them to sort of open up, as you could say, contrarians, is to really listen to all their issues, right? And so what we did was we said, okay, let's not, we've got the proposal, let's put that to a side. The next meeting, what we're going to do, or next couple of meetings we're going to do, is you guys need to bring in all your favorite things in the world and describe them to us. Right? Describe them to us. And that was very, they were kind of confused, but they did it. They thought it was actually, confusing, but actually kind of interesting. So they brought in, like, sneakers, jackets, guitars, you name it. They brought in all this stuff. And each one of them started talking about why they love this object so much. Right? And what we were trying to do is detail and profile what we can do for them. That was the only way we could break them down to become who they are today, right? And they started to slowly listen to us. And so sometimes it takes very sort of unorthodox methods to get somebody to listen to, for you to listen to them, and then them to listen to you. And that's an important thing. I don't know if I answered the question, but, or part of it, I think.
Just to add to that real quick, I think that it just comes back to the theme I think that's been throughout this conversation is empathy, where what you're doing is meeting people at their level. right? You're not coming in like you're the expert and they got to listen to you because they're paying you and all these things. It's really about creating an understanding between both sides and working together to create the best outcome, because clearly startups want to be successful. And our job as designers is to help them in the ways that we can, help them be successful, even if it's marginally contributive to how they operate in the world. But I think that ultimately it's about collaboration and working with them and not walking into a room like you know everything.
Yeah.
And startups tend to be financially, working for Coke or working for a startup is not the same thing. Obviously, Coke will have a much fatter budget than the startup. But the experience of working with a startup is quite energizing, I'd say, because they're very virgin in the sense of they're starting a business, they don't really know what's going to happen to them. They're trying hard, they have little money, every day that goes, they burn these X dollars and they want to really, the days, the countdown is there, and there's a pressure and there's a vibrancy there that it's really, really nice. I mean, I think it's the work you create with startups it's super invigorating. I really, really like it.
One last thing on that, just the invigorating part of it. I think often what happens when you work at big, established, corporate, matrixed organizations is it's harder to get interesting work through because there's so many layers. And startups are fun to work on because half the time it's the Wild West. And they're like, I don't know, that looks good, let's do that. So I think that more often than not, you can get some of the bravest work through with startups because they're fundamentally brave people by the virtue of the fact that they're creating a startup.
And they got nothing to lose.
Yeah, they have nothing to lose. So sometimes
And you're
you
working
get
with the
it.
founders.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And you work with the founder, absolutely.
We'll end off with one last question that I'm seeing coming in, just an ask for some advice, whether it be a book, a role model, just any sort of recommendation you have. Starting today, when we leave this room, what are some action items? How can we become better designers?
I'd say something which is I know it's very difficult, okay? All of you are exceptional guys. You have been admitted into top-notch universities. You are interested in coming and spending a Saturday and a Sunday listening to a bunch of guys that can tell you stories. So instead, lovely weather. Instead of, hey, let's go to Central Park, let's go into a room and listen to these guys, or to a guy like Stuart Weitzman. No matter how good you think you are, there will always be someone smarter than you in the room. Try to dig out, try to bury your ego, and try to really be as humble as possible and learn and listen as much as you can. Everything I know, I was very privileged because I was very close to someone of a magnitude of Wally Ollins for 23 years on a daily basis, and I was a truly privileged person in that regard, in shaping me as a professional and as a human being. And not everybody has the opportunity to be by someone of the caliber of Wally, on a daily basis for 20 years. But try to learn from everybody around you, because there will always be opportunities for you to learn. Bury your ego. No matter how good you are, forget about Princeton, Columbia, Harvard, what have you, there will always be people cleverer than you that you will be able to learn from them. That would be my own personal thing.
It's a tough one to follow. That's a good one. What I would say, generally speaking, especially starting out, is to make sure that you always have a point of view, your point of view. I think it's really important to find your voice as a designer, to find what interests you, how you come at a solution, how you think about a challenge, and making sure that you always have a point of view. But at the same time, to Jacob's point, be willing to learn and to be willing to crumble that point of view in an instant if someone smarter than you has a better idea. So be open to other people's ideas. Make sure that you never walk into a room with no idea.
And on top of this, I would say, sorry for interrupting, dare to make mistakes. Don't worry, make mistakes, make them. You will never learn more than by making mistakes.
Yeah. All these points are exceedingly important, and I'd like to sort of add to that with a few years ago, I said to myself, and what am I gonna, when I'm dying on my deathbed, what have I done? It's not so much achieved, but like done. Can I relay it to somebody? Like Eddie Opara was a graphic designer, and they're like, what was that? Think about it from the future. What was the point of this? And so I started to sort of create this this range of what I call language, or you could say methodologies or principles that I actually have. It's a very important sort of exercise to do, but you're never going to, you start it now, but you should never finish it now. It's going to, through all the experiences, you're going to keep adding to it. Failure is one of those, and defining what failure is to you, it may be slightly different to somebody else, but it's something that you have to learn about, and not see it as a negative, right? And that how it can actually connect into other parts of this particular frequency that you're creating for yourself, and that's it's an exceptional sort of exercise to actually do. It's a little bit like writing a diary per se, and sort of learning from others to actually build that over the course of time is exceedingly important. It's a very hard thing to achieve, but then you also do it. Then you indicate it to the work that you've been part of, and you start to create the narrative, the story of who you are as a designer. Like it's taken in different paths, but for very clear purposes and clear outcomes, and thus you can basically say, I know who I am, and then die. But sorry, I didn't want to.
I think we should end on that.
Quite an ending. All right, thank you so much. That was an amazing conversation and for the great advice.